All right, next up, after that in-depth look at the kick and bass, we're going to look at the drums. I wanted breaks. I've been using breaks all the time recently. I use different drum and bass sample libraries to get really nice breaks. And what I've done in this instance is I've taken the audio file of the drum and bass breaks loop, brought it into Logic, and chopped it up, converting it into a Logic sampler instrument. Logic can detect the transients within the audio file, the drum loop, and it can then chop out each transient as its own mini audio file, and then it loads that into sampler. And then you've got control. You can change the amp of the sound. You can make it tighter and more punchy. You can change the tuning of the sound, and you can also you've got the whole drum loop now as MIDI, so you can cut out different parts you want. So in this case, I sort of put all of the break onto different channels, so I could process each element individually and get clean access to different parts. So here's the snare. Then there's these other snares, and I've panned one slightly left, one slightly right. Down the bottom of the drum section, I think there's the breaks hat here. So that was in the original. And then there's also this part. Really low in the mix. Might just turn my mastering back on so you guys can hear a bit clearer. So that's quite a lot of the original break that I'd found. Let's break the different elements of that down. Starting with the snare. I'm using gain to put it in mono. Utility gain to put it into mono, so it's right in the middle of the mix. Decapitator is driving the sound that little bit more. I wanted it to hit a little bit harder. Just turn off the processing. So before, you can see how the sound, like, it hit a little bit left. Now I could pan it slightly right to compensate, but in this instance I just put it in mono. Drove it with Decapitator. Quite a bit. I love playing with these different styles down the bottom. It's worth doing that in Decapitator. And then Pro Key 3, rolling off lots of the low end here on this sound, and also taking away some of the high end. Sorry about the delay, by the way. I don't know what happened on this project, but there's a bit of a delay. And then a little bit of reverb, using the Space Designer reverb that we talked about before. It's quite a big reverb, but it doesn't last for long. It's quite upfront, just adds a nice sustain sometimes. Similar processing on the left snare and the right with the Decapitator and Pro Q3. I might have EQ'd them. No, they've got the same EQ, so they're just panned left and right. And they're 1 dB lower in the mix, so that's it really. Next element is the off hat. Probably a hat I sampled from Dusky, maybe. Once again, put it in mono, because before it was really stereo, which might have been desirable, but in this instance I didn't think so. I've used other bits for width in my drums. Rolled off these frequencies under 500 hertz. Another hat here. Once again, it's in mono. Rolled off frequencies under 500. This one's got a little bit more of a real organic drum kit vibe. And then we've got another hat here from a 909. Really love that 909 sound. It's mono, it's right in the middle, rolled off frequencies probably under 500, driven it a little bit with Decapitator. All in all, it just added a bit more to the groove. We've got a ride cymbal, again a 909 ride cymbal, rolling off frequencies under 500, using that free plugin Wider to give that a bit of extra stereo width. Love to introduce the ride that little bit later on here so that everything's just progressing and building. Then we've got a closed 909 hat to give that sort of 16th note energy. Rolling off frequencies under 1000 hertz. Bit of a little bit of sidechain pump happening here at 40%. I don't often like it when drums hit at the same time as the kick drum. Sometimes I feel like it takes away from the clarity, the cleanliness, that kick click. So that's why I use Shaperbox sometimes. I think having this 16th note rhythm is really important for giving energy into the track. Sometimes if you feel like the track's missing energy, adding like a 16th note drum sound, a hat or a shaker or something can really add. Full drum kit. When I'm mixing, oh yeah, we've also got some tambourines that come even later on to add even more. And there's some little bits, some atmospheric bits. We've got like this sound which was from the original Among Us sample, which doesn't want to play for some reason. Maybe that's filtered down there. So that sound used to sound like this. I think I'd used Logic's flex time and just quantized it, and then sort of just dragged the different transients into a rhythm that I liked, and then I rebounced it, so I had a clean version of it. Sound shift, pitched it so it was in the same key as the track. Pro key 3, just took out everything I didn't want in the sound. Shaperbox, gave a bit of sidechain pump. Echo Boy Jr. gave it nice ping pong delay. And then Volcano I've used to introduce the sound in and out of the mix. Snare rolls, I've got two snare rolls, 2 layers. This is quite common thing I've been doing. I have a 909 layer, which might be this one, using battery, and then like a nice 909 snare, using Volcano to filter the sound into the mix, just bringing the high end into the mix. I'm using gain just to fade the volume of the sound into the mix so it keeps building and growing. and then just some simple EQ to roll off frequencies I didn't want under 200 hertz. Little bit of a reverb on that snare roll, and then we've got another layer here which is more of an 808 snare. This one's got a nice stereo width to it. Same thing, filtering it in with Volcano and fading it in with gain. Little bit of space design on that one too. Do I filter that? Yeah, so it looks like I have that come in quite reverbed up, which you probably won't hear, to be honest. It's probably an unnecessary thing. It does reverb up at the end there right before the drop. Yeah, and then classic, I've not done that. This is the first time I've done that probably ever in a track, but this used to be like really common in old trance music and stuff, like the old ravey stuff, the crashes. Then a nice reverse at the end with lots of reverb on it, and that, yeah. So most of the drums, notes about my drums. The way that I mix drums is that I start with my clap or my snare, the element that hits at the same time as the kick drum, and let's take off processing so I can sort of demonstrate this. I start by soloing the kick drum, and I look at the stereo out and I look at where the kick drum on its own is peaking. It's peaking at minus 10.9 dB. When kicks hit at the same time as snares or claps, I always notice this big spike there's a big spike of sound. That can be a nightmare to control in mastering. And it took my ears a long time to realise that there was such a big sort of summing happening, if that's the right word, where the kick and the clap hit at the same time. It sounded right to my ears, like where I was putting the clap in the mix, but when they hit at the same time, it was just making mastering an absolute nightmare, and I'd have to really crush that transient of the kick plus the clap. And similar to what I was talking about with my low end, I realised, I needed to turn down my claps a lot. And something I've been doing, so I'll note down the level that the kick peaks out on its own, and my rule of thumb is that when the kick and the snare hit at the same time, I don't like the increase to go above 2 dB higher than when the kick's on its own. So in this instance, when I turn on the snare, I don't want this number to go above minus 8.9. There's a 2 dB increase in volume. I feel like that is about enough. That's about as much as I sort of allow for my snare. You can make the snare louder by, you could limit the sound so that you cut out some of the transient, and you sort of emphasize more the body of the sound. So the bit that we hear for longer, when you make that a bit louder than the initial transient, then you might be able to push the sound of the clap up if you don't feel like it's sitting loud enough in the mix, and you'll still be able to get that 2 dB increase. In this case, let's have a look at where it peaks at. So minus 9.1. So I could by my logic could have pushed up that a little bit higher, but I think that sounded quite nice there. I can use tools like Smexoscope to have a look. At the increase there, like you can see that there's a bit of it does spike up when the snare hits. That's okay, I can control that. But like if it's a massive difference, it just makes mastering a nightmare. So that's my snare. Once I've got the level of the snare from following this process, I then add in the rest of my drums, but my snare becomes sort of commander-in-chief to my drums. So that is always going to be like the loudest drum element in my drum section. I love to use Smexoscope when I'm mixing my drums, and I take my snare to start with. For every sound, I love to go through and just, if it's got unnecessary spikiness to the transients, often I will go in and compress it, or use a limiter just to shave off those transients, because they are loud in the mix. They make a limiter work harder, but the human ear isn't really going to pick all of them up. So I just shave off some of the unnecessary transients of sounds. Don't do it all the time. I'm not that over the top. Like in this case, I could possibly have just shaved off these little bits at the bottom here, a little bit anal maybe, but I've done that for every drum element. Start with my snare. Next most important element, in my opinion, is the off hats. When these are playing, I like them to have about the same peak volume as the snare. So let's see what. Let's take off the 909. Let's take off those jacking ones as well. So it's got almost the same volume. That's sort of how I like to balance those guys. Then I've added the 909 in. Yeah, about the same amount of weight there. If I just shaved off that transient, that snare would have the same. It'd be about the same. And we've got the ride cymbal added in. I like my 16 notes. That's often when I can do something a bit more like that. Use the Haas effect with sample delay. Like in this instance, to add a little bit of extra width to the drums. If you're not familiar with this effect, you're basically delaying how quickly the sound comes out of one of the channels, the left or the right. Your brain hears the sound come out of the left speaker, so it's like 100% panned left, and then it hears it almost instantly come out of the right speaker, panned 100% right. Your brain just interprets that as this really super wide sound. If I can just, so that's turned off, then turned on. Do you hear how it just goes nice and wide, and it sort of tickles that really far left and right part of your ears? So yeah, so mixing drums for me is having the core elements like the snare, the hats, mono, central in the mix, but then having some of these 16th note elements and more atmospheric drum sounds to pan and use a bit more to sort of fill more of the stereo field. So I got the main bits in the middle, and then sort of gradually trying to fill lots of that space to make it nice and wide sounding. Finally, I send all of those guys, all of the drums go to not the kick though, that's gone to the kick and bass channel. I don't include the kick, but I include a clap, and all of the rest of the drums, they go to their own auxiliary channel where I roll off unnecessary frequencies. I compress the guys together just to glue it all together that little bit more. I'm not using Mag EQ4. Initially I'd used that, I think, to create a little bit more high frequencies on the drums. Yeah, bit of a parallel distortion there provided by Soundtoys Devil Lock. That added a bit more body, a bit more grit to the drums. See if we can hear that. And then it's really, really subtle though, really subtle. And then we've got that parallel vocal compressor again for some added punchiness. And yeah, the nice thing about this is once all the drums are there, and you're happy with all the levels of all of the different elements, you now have one fader to sort of, oh, the drums aren't loud enough, let's push it up by 1 dB, or they're too loud, bring it down by 1 dB. So that's really nice. So now we've got our sidechain trigger, and we've got our bass line. With the reference mastering turned on, I now can sort of get a sense of if my drums are hitting high enough in the high end, and my low end is hitting high enough in the low end. Without going into all the detail, because I just don't have time, but I'm running a really rough master to achieve a comparable loudness to other records on like the label I'm releasing on, stuff I'm inspired by. I use Logic's level meter to tell me what RMS I'm working at. I'm aiming for just around -8, maybe just slightly over it. Once I've hit that loudness, I know that that's sort of a comparable loudness to other records that my music sounds similar to, and now I can use Voxengo Span and measure how high the high end is. I want my high end sort of just coming up to this -36 line, and my low end is going to come up to about this -33 line. Now, if the high end isn't hitting that line, I know that I can go to the auxiliary here. I can push the drums up a little bit more to achieve that high end. If it's too loud, I can pull it down. Same thing for the low end. It's a really important thing I do. But yeah, as you can see there, high end is hitting quite nicely, almost at the -36. Low end is at -33. So I'm happy with that. I've already mixed this track, so I know that's right. But sometimes, yeah, it is a case of, right, the kick and bass channel, I need to go there, I need to pull that fader down slightly because it's too much, or the high end needs to come up. Reference. It's just absolutely so key. So that's my drums.